Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. It's the morning of July 21st, 1865 in Springfield, Missouri. Davis Tutt has already been to court once today, and the pressure is on. He's a former Confederate soldier from Yellville, Arkansas, a drifter in a town full of drifters, and his finances are tight enough that a disputed gambling debt is worth fighting over. He has a plan. Last night at the Lion House Hotel, he walked away from a poker table with something that didn't belong to him. A gold Waltham pocket watch lifted off the felt while its owner was outnumbered and in no position to stop him. He's holding it as collateral on a debt the other man claims doesn't exist at the amount Tutt says it does. Tutt says the debt is $35. The other man says it's $25 and has a written record in his jacket pocket to prove it. This morning, Tutt walks into the town square with that watch hanging from his pocket in plain view of anyone who cares to look. This is the move: public humiliation. In a frontier economy with no credit bureau, no collection agency, and no court that two gamblers are going to trust with a disputed poker debt, the only enforcement tool available is reputation. Make the other man look like a deadbeat in front of the whole town, and he'll pay just to make it stop. Tutt has done the calculation. He has friends. He has leverage. He has the watch. He is confident enough in his position that when the other man crosses the town square towards him, Tutt doesn't back down. He reaches for his gun. He misses. The other man doesn't. Tutt calls out, "Boys, I'm killed," and falls dead on the courthouse steps. So how does a $10 dispute over a poker debt become the moment that defines an entire mythology? How does a frontier economy without courts, contracts, or credit systems produce an enforcement mechanism so extreme that a jury has to invent a legal doctrine on the spot to explain why it was justified? And how did all of that come together on July 21st, 1865, in the town square of Springfield, Missouri, when a man named Wild Bill Hickok settled a debt the only way the world around him knew how? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, July 21st, that story takes us to 1865, the first showdown. Springfield, Missouri in 1865 was a town trying to figure out what it was. The Civil War had ended only a few months earlier, and the frontier was filling up with veterans from both sides who had no obvious next move. Men trained in violence, accustomed to living outside normal civilian structures, with skills that didn't translate cleanly into peacetime employment. Davis Tutt had fought for the Confederacy in the Trans-Mississippi Theater and drifted north after the surrender. James Butler Hickok, who went by Wild Bill, had spent the war as a Union scout and spy and mustered out in June 1865, just weeks before their confrontation. They had ended up in the same town, on opposite sides of the same gambling tables, and for a while they were friends. The falling out, as these things often do, involved money and women in roughly equal measure. The details are murky, but the result was clear. By the summer of 1865, Tutt had made it his project to bankrupt Hickok, openly lending money and advice to other card players specifically to beat him. This was not personal in the small sense. In a frontier economy with no credit bureaus, no collection agencies, and no reliable infrastructure for disputes between drifters and gamblers, a man's reputation for paying his debts was the only financial instrument he had. Damage the reputation, and you damaged the man's ability to earn, borrow, and operate. When Tutt reached across the poker table at the Lion House Hotel on the night of July 20th and took Hickok's gold Waltham pocket watch, he understood exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just taking collateral on a disputed debt. He was making a public statement in front of witnesses that Hickok was the kind of man whose property could be taken without consequence. Hickok, surrounded by Tutt's armed associates and outgunned in the room, had no immediate recourse. He warned Tutt not to wear the watch in public. Tutt replied with what witnesses described as an ugly grin and walked out with it. The next morning, Tutt walked into the town square with the watch hanging openly from his pocket. Word reached Hickok within the hour. The two men met on the square to negotiate, but the terms had shifted overnight. Tutt was now demanding $45, up from the $35 he had claimed the night before, while Hickok maintained the debt was $25 and he had the paperwork to prove it. Mutual acquaintances tried to get them to split the difference, but neither man moved. Both of them understood the logic of what came next because both of them had grown up in a world where this was the logic. Tutt had already committed publicly to the watch display, and backing down would signal cowardice that would end his standing in Springfield just as surely as the debt was supposed to end Hickok's. Hickok had already warned him and been ignored, and absorbing that publicly would destroy the reputation he depended on to earn a living. There was no neutral arbiter to call. There was no court both men trusted. There was only the square and the people watching. Around 6 in the evening, the two men faced each other across roughly 75 yards of open ground. Witness Richard Bentley Owen later recalled, "At that moment, you could have heard a pin drop in that square." Tutt drew first. Hickok raised his Colt Navy revolver, braced it across his forearm, and fired once. Tutt's shot missed. Hickok's didn't. Tutt walked a few steps and fell dead on the courthouse steps. Hickok was arrested 2 days later, charged with manslaughter. The trial lasted 3 days, with 22 witnesses from the square. The judge gave the jury 2 instructions that contradicted each other: convict under the law as written, or apply the unwritten frontier doctrine of the fair fight and acquit. The jury deliberated for about 2 hours and acquitted. As one historian later put it, "Nothing better described the times than the fact that dangling a watch held as security for a poker debt was widely regarded as a justifiable provocation for resorting to firearms." The frontier's enforcement system had just validated itself in open court. What the Hickok-Tutt shootout actually demonstrates is what happens to credit and debt enforcement when formal institutions don't exist and aren't trusted. The informal system that produced the town square confrontation wasn't lawlessness exactly. It had its own logic, its own rules, and, as the trial showed, its own court of appeal. But it was fragile and expensive in ways that only became obvious when you saw the outcome: a dead man on the courthouse steps, a $10 debt still disputed, an acquittal that satisfied almost nobody. A prominent Springfield attorney denounced the verdict from the courthouse balcony as against the evidence and all decency. And there was serious talk of lynching Hickok before things calmed down. The institutions that replaced this system were built specifically to avoid repeating it: civil courts with jurisdiction over contract disputes, legal frameworks for debt collection, and eventually credit systems that made a man's financial reputation verifiable without requiring a public confrontation to establish it. Those systems are slow, imperfect, and occasionally maddening. They are also the reason that the dispute between you and a vendor over an invoice gets resolved by a strongly worded letter from an attorney rather than the alternative. A few weeks after the shooting, a Harper's New Monthly Magazine correspondent named George Ward Nichols arrived in Springfield and started asking questions. The article he eventually published in February 1867 was built on the bones of what actually happened and dressed in something considerably more dramatic. In his writing, Nichols credited Hickok with killing 100 men, surviving a single-handed fight against a gang of 10, and riding a horse of near mythical obedience. The article was an immediate bestseller, and the market it found was a national audience hungry for exactly that story. Frontier journalism of the area wasn't primarily in the business of historical record, it was in the business of readers, and readers wanted the myth more than the facts. The civilization that built courts and contracts to make the town square confrontation unnecessary spent the next 150 years watching versions of it on movie screens and calling it romantic. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business better without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.